Thank you, Darren. Good afternoon. It's 2:01. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. The Red Cross is attempting to carry out another evacuation in the besieged Ukrainian city of Mariupol. It follows an agreement with Russia to open 7 humanitarian corridors for civilian evacuations today. Overnight, buses of refugees arrived in Zaporizhia. Some of the passengers are reported to have stood throughout the 12-hour journey due to huge numbers of people trying to escape. Ukraine is warning of what they're calling heavy battles in the country's eastern and southern regions, including Mariupol. An advisor to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says that troops around Kyiv had retaken more than 30 towns or villages in the region. He also says troops were holding the front line against Russian forces in the east. It follows President Zelensky saying the situation remains difficult.
In
the north of the country, the occupiers continued to retreat, slowly but noticeably. In the east, the situation remains extremely difficult. Russian troops are moving to Donbass and towards Kharkiv. They're preparing new strikes. We're preparing an ever more active defence.
Russia's space director says his country will no longer cooperate on the International Space Station. Dmitry Rogozin says normal ties with NASA and other agencies will only be possible once what he's calling illegal sanctions against Moscow are lifted. It's after an American astronaut and 2 Russian cosmonauts landed safely in Kazakhstan on Wednesday, having left the ISS on board the same capsule. It's been confirmed Metropolitan Police Commissioner Dame Cressida Dick will leave her post on the 10th of April. She's tweeted, "It's been a tremendous honour to serve the people of London and the UK." Dame Cressida quit in February after the Mayor of London said he'd lost confidence in her leadership. The suspension of P&O ferry services is being partly blamed for long queues at Dover today. Drivers have reportedly been forced to wait for hours to board ferries. The Department for Transport says efforts are being made to minimise the disruption. Protests are taking place across the UK today over the rising price of energy bills. Yesterday, millions around the UK saw their energy bills go up by an average of £700,000 a year as price caps rose. An austerity campaign group says the demonstrations highlight the real hardships people are facing, with many having to choose whether to eat or heat. Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Brandon Lewis, has told GB News the government can't completely nullify the impacts of global pressures on energy prices.
This is why the Chancellor put in place such a big package. It's now about £22 billion worth of support, with the biggest tax reduction overall in about 25 years, to put more money in people's pockets to deal with some of these challenges. But it is a global challenge that was building before the Ukraine invasion by Putin, and it's something that invasion is putting further pressure on, obviously.
The Prime Minister has welcomed a 2-month truce agreed by the warring sides in Yemen. Boris Johnson says it could provide an end to the suffering there. The deal, negotiated by the United Nations between the Saudi-led coalition and Iran-backed Houthi rebels, is due to come into effect later this afternoon. The organisation estimates nearly 400,000 people have been killed during the 7-year conflict, and millions have been pushed into hunger. Here, parents and carers can now book COVID jabs for children aged between 5 and 11 years old in England. They'll be able to make an appointment for a vaccine or go to a walk-in clinic from Monday. Children will be offered 2 doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech jab, at least 12 weeks apart. And today marks 40 years since Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands. 255 British soldiers died, along with 650 Argentinians. It was after Margaret Thatcher ordered the territory to be recaptured. Pipers are being asked to play in a national commemoration on June the 18th to remember those who were killed and wounded in the 74-day conflict. Former head of the British Army, General Lord Dannatt, has told GB News he remembers where he was when he heard about the invasion.
In 1982, I was a student at the Army Staff College at Camberley, and someone came into our syndicate discussion room and said the Argentinians have invaded the Falklands. And we all said to each other, where are the Falklands? So we sent someone off to the library to get an atlas, because I'm afraid there was a view. They were off Scotland. But of course, as we all realised, it was 8,000 miles down there in the South Atlantic. And that kicked off that day, that extraordinary adventure, which sadly led to the loss of 255 British servicemen.
This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now it's back to Darren.
Welcome to Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes. Here's what's coming up on the show. In the midst of a cost of living crisis where council tax and energy bills are going up, should we ban promotional offers on meat? A report from the charity Eating Better says some of the UK's biggest supermarkets are bombarding us with cheap meat. Perish the thought, jog on. We'll also be putting the Human Rights Act through scrap reform. Keep. Justice Secretary Dominic Raab has received criticism about trying to replace the Human Rights Act with a British Bill of Rights. We'll have another campus clash this afternoon too. Today we'll be discussing whether or not now is the time to commit to reaching net zero. That's what we're talking about for the next hour. Lots coming up. I'd love to know your thoughts on the cost of living crisis with the big changes being introduced yesterday. I want to know, what are your thoughts or your biggest concerns? Do tweet me at GBNews or email me at gbviews@gbnews.uk. You can watch us online too on YouTube, and don't forget we're on Facebook. Search for GB News and you'll find us. Thank you very much. Well, according to the newspapers this morning, Boris Johnson's radical plan for solving Britain's reliance upon gas from elsewhere is to relax planning permission on wind farms near you. So if you don't want one of these, steel, cement and behemoths towering near your home, blighting the English countryside, it's tough, folks, because interestingly enough, you can oppose planning permission and you can object to works near you removed and have them removed in an instant when it comes to these other forms of energy, like fracking, like nuclear. But when it comes to wind, you're not going to get a choice. You might not even be asked. So I want to ask you, why only allow one form of energy to be built in Britain? Why don't we allow the market to decide instead of politicians trying to centrally plan the economy like a Soviet with a 5-year plan? I agree that we need energy security. Believe me, you'll find no stronger an ally on that point. But I don't agree with our methods of obtaining it. When governments tried to get us to drive diesel cars, we were told later that they were poisoning our environment. When we were burning so-called renewable wood pellets, we chopped down forests and burnt the wood, which eventually led to emitting more CO2 than the coal we'd actually rushed to replace it with. And of course, we failed to invest in nuclear thanks to the green extremes' campaigns against it, which has seen France much more protected from the rising cost of wholesale energy than we here in Britain. So governments have made a hell of a lot of mistakes, in my view, in this very area. And I say, get out of the way. Allow the market to decide what the best course of action is. If that's these new green technologies, brilliant. But until that's ready, until they come galloping down the hill like a knight on a valiant steed, we need gas. But all we're getting from this government, I'm afraid, is hot air. And the energy price cap, far from shielding consumers from the brute force of market competition, has actually destroyed any competition whatsoever. If you were with one of the smaller energy companies, there's a high chance, statistically speaking, that your energy company has gone under. It's competition, folks, that drives standards and lowers prices. You know, imagine Aldi against Tesco. You're seeing a price war between the two of them. So now, the only energy companies that exist are the bigger ones. They've survived. And instead of getting used to price rises as they come, we now have to face massive, steep increases every 6 months when the energy price cap is raised by the regulator. What we need is greater competition and greater suppliers, a greater number of those suppliers in the energy mix. Now, folks, you might be bored rigid hearing about energy and taxes, and here's a real-world example of why I actually think that should matter to everyone. If you take your local chippy, for example, right, you might occasionally enjoy a chippy tea. How many of us have relied on our local when we get in from work and cannot be bothered to get ourselves in the kitchen? Well, folks, because life in Britain is now so expensive, many of them might not make it through this year. Overheads have soared massively. We're seeing council tax shoot up, we're seeing VAT on food go back up, and of course the cost of electricity and fuel, increasing the transportation of fish, potatoes and those large fryers that are used in our great British chippies. And I don't know about you, but I look around my local area, and as much as I love the North East, I look around and I think, my God, why am I paying some of the largest council tax rates in the country? I'll be all right, right? I live on my own. But what about Arthur and Martha down the road, trying to get by on their pension? Or a young couple trying to start a family? Or a small business owner, might well be a chippy, with a small business acting as the backbone of the British economy? We risk losing so much more than pence and pound. Now, sticking with the theme of the rising cost of living, is now the time to really ban promotions on cheap meat? An article in The Guardian caught my attention and my blood pressure actually, which claims that our supermarkets are bombarding shoppers with cheap meat. The charity Eating Better say that we are being relentlessly targeted by buy one, get one free offers on burgers, sausages and cheap chicken of unknown origin, putting profit before population, health and that of the planet. Well, folks, we're going to debate this now. I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Matthew Appleby, author of Super Organic Gardener, Vegan Garden, and farmer Gareth Wynne Jones, and animal rights activist Joey Carbstrong. Matthew, can we start with you, please? Should we actually ban these offers for cheap meat in all of our supermarkets at a time when, let's not be honest, people are really, really struggling?
Well, thanks for inviting me on, Darren. I don't think we should ban them. And I'd probably make the point that various studies have found that meat is more expensive than veg to buy. So, you know, there's a 40% less cost if you eat vegetables and don't eat meat. So I'd suggest that, you know, meat is expensive. So, you know, cheap meat is not necessarily good for the environment and good for people's health. It has a wider cost, animal rights too. So, yeah, I mean, I think eating vegetables is cheaper. Loads of studies have found this out. So maybe think about that.
Gareth, what do you think?
It's about a balanced diet, isn't it? You know, and getting the right nutrition. And that's really important. I'm a livestock farmer up here, you know, we're in the middle of lambing and calving. Them lambs now will be ready from August onwards. And, you know, that's what pays my bills, keeps the roof above my head. And, you know, we're very, very lucky in this country that we're supported by the British public. You know, meat is very, very nutritious, especially grass fed, you know, lamb or beef. I keep a little bit of pigs as well, so they get some of the, you know, the stuff that comes from my vegetable plot that we don't want. And I use the manure as well from the back end of the cows to grow my veg. So all that is the circle of life, and that is a very important part of going forward. We need to educate people, you know, to buy proper meat that's produced in an ethical, sustainable and regenerative way. And I think we can do this by working together and making sure that the public get the right message.
Gareth, how hard would you be hit if Joey, we're going to come to Joey in a second, but if Joey and his clan got their way and actually your industry was redundant, you're done for?
They're about 3 to 5% of the population, so I'm not worried about little Joey, to be honest with you. What we carry on is, we get the support. The majority of the British public are behind us. And, I was getting maybe £4 a kilo last 2 years ago. We're up to £6 and £7 a kilo for lamb. The demand's out there. Everybody's shouting for it because they know it's sustainable. It's really healthy for you. It's full of top quality protein, nutrition, all the vitamins you want. So, I'm not worried one iota about Joey and his little gang, to be honest with you.
Joey, I'm going to let you come in now. Are you worried about the impact that encouraging the British people to get off meat would actually have on farmers and actually some of the poorest people in society that would have to potentially go for more expensive vegan-friendly products?
Listen, you're talking about banning the promotion of cheap meat, and this Gareth guy's got one of these small holding farms where, it doesn't represent the majority of farming in the UK anyway. 85% of UK animals are factory farmed. Of the billion chickens that are slaughtered here every year in this country, 95% of them are factory farmed. And over the last 16 weeks, none of them have been let out because of bird flu. So you're talking about factory farmed animals predominantly. Over 90% of the pigs here are factory farmed. And they're killed in gas chambers, one of the cruelest ways to die. And no animal welfare organisation denies that. So Gareth represents, he called us 3 to 5%. Gareth actually represents a small percentage of what the meat that's actually eaten. And if you're worried about expensive, then this grass-fed, small-holding, free-range, unaccessible meat is one of the most expensive foods you can basically buy. And also, the cheapest foods in the supermarket, the rice, the beans, the oats, the lentils, are some of the cheapest, some of the cheapest. And you're laughing there. Do you think gas chambers are funny, Garth?
Yeah, Gareth, I'll just let you come in on that.
Little Joey, you just make me laugh, honestly. You've got no idea. You've got no idea. Look, I run a flock of 4,000 ewes, okay? 4,000 ewes, okay? We've got 300 head of cattle. It's a partnership, it's a business, it's not a factory farm. The majority of the animals in this country are outside, mate. They're outside. No, okay, they've got a bit of problems with
chickens. Where do the chickens live, mate? They haven't been outside for 16 weeks because of bird flu, and 95% of them are factory farmed. These aren't even my stats. Look them up yourself. Over 800 mega-style US farms in the UK, over 800. So you're telling me that all of these are out on grass? You're part of the problem, see? You're the one who's propagating these humane lies to the public. They go in the supermarket and they think it's all green grass and pastures. I investigate these farms. I do it all the time. I'm in there seeing the chickens dying on their faces. They go into gas chambers. You think it's funny? Pigs die in gas chambers, 86% of them. That's a DEFRA stat, and they suffer in these gas chambers to death. And you're laughing because you think it's funny. How would you like to trade places with these animals, Gareth?
I'm laughing at you. You have got no idea.
I'm laughing at you. I'm laughing
at
you.
I imagine, Zoe, a lot of farmers...
Listen, you're sitting in your vegan world. You've got no idea how your food's produced. I bet you don't grow anything.
I'm an investigator.
I grow my own
I'm an
vegetables.
investigator.
I grow my own fruit.
I investigate these farms all the time. We research these farms.
Guys, if we talk over each other, no one's going to hear anything. No one's going to hear anything.
Produce my vegetables on my plate than it does for my meat. One cow will feed many, many families for a long time. So you get your facts right. You're living in cuckoo land, mate.
Right, guys. Matthew, I want to bring you in on what you've just heard there. Do you actually think that this country is quite unique in buying these forms of meat and farming that are actually of detriment to both the environment and indeed animals? Because we are painted as being a nation of animal lovers, aren't we?
Well, no, I mean, I'm kind of moderate. I'm kind of in between there. I think some people will always eat meat, and I don't think, I wouldn't say ban anything. But at the same time, there's an environmental cost. Animals don't want to die, and as Joey says, chickens stuck in battery farms. That's cruel. I mean, that's full stop. You can't argue that that's not cruel.
Well, I would totally agree with those sentiments as well. That's where I think there would be broad agreement. But what I will say is on the actual question that were posed there at the very start of this discussion, I actually worry that banning promotional offers on meat does mean that people are going to really struggle because, as you say, Matthew, people are not just going to stop eating meat, are they? I'm certainly not.
Well, I mean, the cheap protein comes from chicken, but, you know, the studies I mentioned earlier on say that, you know, not eating meat is cheaper than eating meat, no matter what level of society you're at. It's an education thing. The government needs to educate people how to cook. And during the pandemic, people learned how to cook. They didn't go out. They didn't, you know, eat their steak in the restaurant. You know, during the war, people lived healthier because they didn't get much meat. They didn't get much sugar. They had a government-controlled diet. I'm not saying have a government-controlled diet, but people should have a choice. But at the same time, because people get to choose what they get to eat, the big cost on the NHS.
Yes, that's the important point for me, because
that's what the animals deserve, a choice not to go into a slaughterhouse to have their head cut off for a sandwich. That is disgusting. And we're talking about 2022. We're still cutting off little lambs' heads for a steak or a lamb chop. Like, what is this? This is not civil.
Opposed to what though, Joey? What are we supposed to eat instead? What would you like us to actually get our protein from?
Well, very good question, mate. I appreciate that. I've been vegan nearly 10 years and I eat whole grains, beans, legumes, fruits and vegetables, local fruits and vegetables. You know, there's no problem getting all of the nutrients you need. You can supplement B12. You don't have to stab a lamb in the throat to get B12 out of their blood. And you can live perfectly healthy without having a billion chickens in factory farms and slaughterhouses.
Right, okay, you've said that. Yes. I've heard about the chickens. Gareth, why should we actually ban cheap meat?
But this bloke's an absolute joke. He's got no idea, you know, where his food's coming from, how many creatures are dying for him to be fed. You know, I know because I'm a farmer. I'm in that field. You know, I see what dies for me to produce my salads, for my tomatoes. You know, everything has got a cost. Everything will have a death toll on it. And Joey sits there as the perfect, you know, person that thinks that he's saving, you know, in Manchester, buying his local produce. I bet he's never grown anything. I bet he's never put his hands in the soil. He hasn't got no understanding of agriculture, farming, and how important livestock is in that space.
A death toll to them too.
I've had the height of artificial fertiliser, which has doubled, okay? So we've gone from £240 per tonne to over £1,000 a tonne. Yeah. Half the food in the world is produced from artificial fertiliser. We need our livestock, we need our manure more than ever to go forward, to grow our vegetables, to grow our salads, to grow our crops.
You need slaughterhouses.
Joey doesn't understand this. He has to start to listen to the people that are working the land and that are feeding him every single day. Because that's what farmers are doing. We're feeding you, Joey.
Thank you, Gareth. Joey, very briefly, please, last word to you.
Well, in Manchester here, there's a gas chamber that kills pigs and they scream. You can hear them screaming. It's aversive to them. I don't know how you justify that by saying, oh, we need their manure. Just because you need manure for the ground doesn't mean you need to murder all those animals in slaughterhouses. I mean, you just like to avoid the slaughterhouse, and a lot of people do. People like Gareth, they propagate humane lies to the public and they get sold this cheap meat. Factory farming is disgusting in this country, just like any other country. And I'm an investigator. I see it all the time, and I see all these false advertisements, and people just got to wake up.
Right. Joey Carbstrong, Gareth Wynne, and Jones, and Matthew Appleby, thank you very much for your time. And now, folks, I don't know about you, but I am not living the life of a hamster. Next, we'll be crossing over live to a protest against the cost of living crisis in Cambridge. They're taking place all over the UK this afternoon. But first, let's have a little look at that weather.
Join me and Naya and Iman for the discussion every Sunday at 3 p.m. here. From big ideas to questions shaping the public conversation, we tackle the moral, cultural and political implications of news stories.
We need to share this conversation democratically.
It has become so toxic, this debate.
They relish this kind of discourse.
From fascinating guests to challenging ideas, you won't want to miss it. The discussion every Sunday at 3 p.m. here, GB News.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed. Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking a mixture of sunny spells and scattered showers and remaining rather chilly. Let's take a look at the details. The southwest will be rather cloudy, particularly in the west, where it will also be most frequent showers. The best of the sunny spells will be across eastern areas. The southwest will be mostly dry, although an isolated light shower is possible this evening. The winds will be light with plenty of sunny spells. There will also be sunny spells and isolated showers across Wales, but drier for much of the day, especially in the west. It will be a mostly dry end to the afternoon across the Midlands too. An isolated light shower is possible, but for most it will be light winds and bright sunny spells. The northeast of England will finish Saturday afternoon with plenty of dry weather. Earlier showers will have faded and we end the day with light winds and plenty of sunshine on offer. Plenty of sunny spells across southern Scotland this evening. There'll also be some fair weather cloud at times too, but it will remain dry to the end of the day. It's a similar story for Northern Ireland this evening. Dry here also, with some fair weather cloud and sunny spells, leading to a cold and frosty night to come. Clear spells and light winds will also lead to a cold and frosty night across most of the UK tonight, and that's how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
The time's 2:29 and right now protests are being held across the country against the rising cost of living. Organised by the People's Assembly, members of the public have been gathering in Newcastle, Cardiff, Birmingham, Liverpool and many others. And you at home have been kind enough to send in some video messages this weekend about your thoughts on the cost of living. So let's hear some of them.
Yes, we all can see that globally the cost of living is going up. It's not just in the UK, it's around the world. Could the Chancellor do more to alleviate the impact of that cost of living rise? I believe he could have done. I believe what he could have done and should have done, in my view, is remove all the green levies that we have on gas and electricity across the UK. It strikes me as ludicrous that we are spending hundreds of millions of pounds on reducing global emissions by 1%. To me, that is completely it's not practicable to continue with that route.
Hello Darren, my name's Keith and I have a simple idea of how to reduce the impact of the cost of living changes immediately. Simply suspend the 25% green energy tax and remove the 5% VAT on fuel bills. We could even place a windfall tax on UK power companies as Labour keep pushing. put money into the pockets of poor people. The government's carbon zero policy has been taken over for at least the last decade, but at what cost to the British people? Does anyone in Westminster know what's going on outside the London bubble? I doubt it. The Green Revolution strikes fear into the hearts of poor and elderly people who have to choose between heating and eating. Labour and the Tories need to engage with people living outside the London bubble or suffer the consequences at the next election.
Well, hey, you've put it better than I ever could, that's for sure. Now, we always want to hear from you, so please do get involved by emailing us at gbviews@gbnews.uk if you'd like to send us a video message for the show next week. You're with GB News on telly and DAB radio. After the news, we'll be putting the Human Rights Act through scrap, reform or keep. The Justice Secretary Dominic Raab has hinted that it might be replaced with a British Bill of Rights. But now, let's get the headlines with Olivia Guthrie.
Darren, thank you. It's 32 minutes past 2. The Red Cross is attempting to carry out another evacuation in the besieged Ukrainian city of Mariupol. It follows an agreement with Russia to open 7 humanitarian corridors for civilian evacuations today. Overnight buses of refugees arrived in Zaporizhia. Some of the passengers are reported to have stood throughout the 12-hour journey due to huge numbers of people trying to escape. Ukraine is warning of what they're calling heavy battles in the country's eastern and southern regions, including Mariupol. An advisor to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says that troops around Kyiv had retaken more than 30 towns or villages in the region. He also said troops were holding the front line against Russian forces in the east. The suspension of P&O ferry services is being partly blamed for long queues at Dover today. Drivers have reportedly been forced to wait for hours to board ferries. The Department for Transport says efforts are being made to minimise the disruption. It's been confirmed Metropolitan Police Commissioner Dame Cressida Dick will leave her post on the 10th of April. She's tweeted, "It's been a tremendous honour to serve the people of London and the UK." Dame Cressida quit in February after the Mayor of London said he'd lost confidence in her leadership. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to Darren after this short break.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Now, regular viewers of the show will remember that last weekend's campus clash, we asked the question, should Britain pay reparations for our colonial past? Have a listen to what one of our contributors, Anna McGovern, had to say on the show. She received quite a significant backlash for this on, guess what, Twitter.
Because the really important thing to recognise is that the British Empire was the one that ended the slave trade with the Abolition Act in 1833. We had 40% of our national budget, with that equating to 40 million, to go towards this, which we were paying until 2015. And technically, we're still paying this back right now in tax. So I think to say that we, in modern day society should be carrying this and should be paying reparations, I think is the wrong answer, really. Because I think we should learn from our mistakes, and I think we all recognise that slavery is an abhorrent thing that ever happened.
Now, you might well be thinking, well, I thought what Anna said there was very sensible, sound and sensible. So we've decided to get a top historian on to explain when we brought freedom for slaves and where money went that we actually spent on that freedom. I'm joined now by Dr. Zaria Masani, who is a historian and author. He also spent 2 decades as a current affairs producer for our good friends at the BBC. Zaria, you've just heard there what Anna McGovern had to say on this show last week. Do you actually agree with what she had to say, Zaria? What was wrong with it?
I completely agree with her about the role of the British Empire in ending the transatlantic slave trade. I think it's important to remember that we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery happened all over the world. It was there were slave markets in Turkey, in North Africa, in the Arab world, in India, in China. So the transatlantic slave trade, which involved West European countries trading slaves across the Atlantic, was very specific. Britain did lead the trade at some point in the 18th century. It also led the abolition of the trade in the early part of the 19th century, and was the first European power to actually abolish it, and used its navy to police the abolition for other countries as well. So Britain, the British Navy, cracked down on the global slave trade. As far as the reparations were concerned, the estimates vary because it's very difficult to estimate what that money meant in today's terms. I think it was around £20 million, and it was paid in various forms, some of it through bonds, some of which, a few of which, only expired very recently. It's not true that the British taxpayer is paying anything anymore. The amount that was paid was to make it possible to abolish the slave trade, because there were huge investments in it, not just from big sugar plantation owners or sugar industry owners, but from very rather indigent, ordinary people in the British population. There were old ladies in Cheltenham whose pension was owning half a slave somewhere in the Caribbean and getting paid for that slave's labor. Those people were totally dependent on slave ownership, which was a global phenomenon, and had to be compensated.
Yeah, so if we consider then, Zaria, I wonder where we actually end up if this debate is allowed to take hold, if this narrative is allowed to take hold. If you consider the British Empire, according to statistics, what did we spend? Something like 40% of our national budget to actually end the slave trade through the might of the Royal Navy. But Zaria, do you think we end up with people saying, well, you know, up until Viceroy Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, do we actually have to, with countries like India, even though we have an incredibly strong bilateral relationship with India now, free and democratic though it is, do we actually owe reparations to other countries around the world, such as India?
No, I don't think anyone, let alone Britain, owes reparations to India. The British invested huge amounts in capital and technology, which they transferred to India from the late 19th century into the 20th century. You know, there was the equivalent of 20 billion pounds of capital that was invested by Britain in India, which allowed the growth of many Indian industries, which are benefiting India today. As far as the reparations for the slave trade are concerned, I think it makes no sense at all, because the British taxpayer today includes many people who are descended from slaves. Why on earth should they pay reparations for something that happened 200 years ago? And very difficult to establish who is descended from whom 200 years ago and who deserves these reparations.
Yeah, Zaria, some have argued that the British Empire spent money compensating and keeping the slave traders happy. First of all, is that true? And second of all, is that because of the fact that what you've just mentioned there, pensions and things like that were actually invested in this admittedly abhorrent trade?
I don't think it was about keeping anyone happy. It was about compensating owners who had invested in the slave trade for about 100 years, many of whom were very small, ordinary people who were not business people at all. So I think in those days, private property was considered fairly sacred. The idea was you didn't expropriate anything without compensation. Owning slaves was, in that sense, like owning land or shares in a business that you were nationalizing. So it was a kind of nationalization for which people had to be paid compensation.
Yeah, I mean, as far as explaining Syria for us, just how far the British Empire went to, I guess, coerce other countries to give up slave trade, how much of a role do you think Britain played in the abolition?
A very major role. I mean, the British legislation came before any of the other European countries, and it led the way, and it provided pressure on other European countries to follow suit, which they did in the next 30, 40, 50 years. But it took a while for them, and certainly for the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French to follow, took a while. But they were forced into it by the fact that Britain did. And one of the reasons Britain was able to lead the way was that the sugar industry was becoming less and less important to Britain, whereas free trade with other areas that were producing sugar, not the British Caribbean areas, but other global areas, meant free trade meant that Britain could actually divert to these other markets, and it didn't need the Caribbean sugar trade anymore.
Zaria, fascinating stuff. Thank you very much. Dr. Zaria Masani there, historian and author. Now, folks, it's 2:43 and it's time for Scrap, Reform or Keep. Justice Secretary Dominic Raab has actually announced plans to replace Labour's Human Rights Act with a British Bill of Rights. So today we're going to put the Human Rights Act to the test. Andrew Tettenborn is a writer and academic and joins me now to discuss it. Andrew, I always read your columns. Can you explain for us in your, I think, excellent way of putting across things what the Human Rights Act actually is in layman's terms?
Right. We are a member of a thing called the European Convention on Human Rights, which is an international treaty which we have to keep under international law. The object of the Human Rights Act is simply to make sure that the English courts have to apply the provisions of the European Convention on Human Rights in English litigation. So the Human Rights Act sits on top of the European Convention on Human Rights.
Andrew, I guess the problem for a lot of people watching this now at home will be a sense of exasperation, actually, because it seems like every Tom, Dick or Harry who is against the West, is opposed to our values, who may well commit acts of terrorism, who may well do all sorts of really wicked things in this country. We can't get rid of them because of human rights legislation. Why is that the case? And I guess why are groups like Amnesty International so opposed to any change in human rights legislation?
Well, I think it's partly that. My own view, you've probably gathered, is that the Human Rights Act does need to be scrapped, but it needs to be scrapped as well as actually getting out of the European Convention on Human Rights, which we can do on 6 months' notice. Now, I can hear large numbers of people in London reaching for pearls to clutch at that particular news. But can I assure them I'm actually all for human rights in a very limited set of circumstances. The point about human rights is that there are some things which are so abhorrent that no state, no democratic state ought ever to do them, and they ought to be put above democracy. Sort of killing people, sending in death squads, torturing people, random home searches, complete restrictions on what people are allowed to say, and so on. Now, I'm very happy to say that those should be beyond democratic control. The problem with the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights is it goes well beyond that and includes very many things that ought to be under democratic control. You've given me one example, and it's a very good example, that we have difficulty deporting criminals who say, oh, well, our right to family life would be affected if you deported me. But it goes much further than that as well. I can give you some examples if you want.
Well, Andrew, on the point of the British Bill of Rights, Dominic Raab has actually said another example of where I think human rights legislation, people are anxious about getting rid of it. You know, I think for most part, the British people probably side between scrap or reform of this legislation because it doesn't actually do what we assume this legislation would do, where we protect the principle of things like freedom of expression. Now, Dominic Raab says that he would make that a key tenet of the British Bill of Rights. Do you agree with that? Do you think that this is the best, most sensible route to go down?
Oh, absolutely. For the moment, yes, because the European Convention on Human Rights actually is very bad on freedom of expression. For example, it tells us that you can't photograph people, even celebrities, in a public place at times. You know, Naomi Campbell can complain that someone photographs her coming out of Narcotics Anonymous. It's said that recently the European Court of Human Rights said that the dead need some sort of protection against attacks on their reputation. All sorts of invasions of privacy are held by the Human Rights Court to override the right to free expression. And that, I think, is wrong. But much more to the point, it's that should be subject to the democratic control of the British people.
Absolutely.
We should decide what the boundary is between freedom of speech and the right to privacy. The problem is that we have a series of unelected judges in Strasbourg taking that decision for us. I don't like it.
No, nor do I. So I'm firmly with you on scrap, Andrew. But as far as, you know, the Conservative Party, you can go back to, I remember Theresa May saying that we were going to do this, but of course we haven't. So time will tell whether or not we get our way. But Andrew Tettenborn, writer and academic, thank you very much for your time. Now, up on Campus Clash, the government are determined in their pursuit to achieve their asphyxiating, in my view, net zero targets by 2050. But that's going to come at a huge cost, particularly to the next generation. So is it really worth it? Especially during, of course, a cost of living crisis. I'm joined now by Jess Gill, a prospective philosophy, politics and economy student, and Ella Carmichael, a politics student at Durham University. Apparently I can't say the word politics today. Can I go to you first, Ella, please? Why should we actually be trying to reach net zero when you consider the fact that we in little old Blighty here emit less than a meagre 1% of global CO2 emissions?
So I think that fundamentally reaching net zero is a goal which is really important, because at the root of the problem is that if we don't reach net zero, eventually we have no planet and therefore no existence. But I think that kind of the broader issue is that the question or the issue really pivots on what Britain's role in kind of the global quest to net zero can be. So broader than just our contributions to this, I think that Britain has a really important role in influencing other countries to also make sacrifices towards net zero, because I think it needs to be a collective global effort. And also, I think that it is important to acknowledge that we should strive towards a way of achieving net zero which doesn't bind us to an unrealistic timeline or ridiculous spending of billions of pounds. But I think that fundamentally reaching for net zero is something that we do need to strive for, but it's more the methods in which we go about it and how we implement it that I think is what's the cause for concern.
Right. And Jess, if I just come to you now, if we are going to do this, right, trying to reach what I describe as asphyxiating net zero targets, do you reckon people in Manchester, you know, Arthur and Martha sat up there in Manchester, that they know now that this country emits less than 1% of global CO2 emissions? Do you think they're going to be willing to actually have to face the choice between heating or eating just to keep the extreme green happy?
Oh yeah, I think that's the point. I think the only person who can decide whether net zero is a sacrifice worth making is the individual. I think the current net zero agenda is promoting, you know, higher taxes and restricting the individual's choice. I think everyone wants a greener, better world. But when it comes to higher energy prices, higher taxes, like you said, I don't think people should have to make that sacrifice. It was like 2/3 of people wanted net zero by 2050, but almost half didn't think that was a sacrifice worth paying when it comes to higher energy bills.
Mm. Yeah, and then Ella, I guess going back to that fundamental point, why are British taxpayers expected to £1 trillion a year, I think was the estimate from the Treasury under Philip Hammond's stewardship. Do you actually think that it's right that British taxpayers cough up when the likes of China are spewing out all of this CO2?
I think it's definitely obviously something which has a lot of controversy and issues surrounding it, and I think that it's obviously definitely a difficult issue, but I think that it kind of comes back to the point of Britain has such an influential role to play in the global arena, and I think that because our emissions are so low, you know, we can really do good work in influencing other countries to follow the same suit, and then hopefully the burden will be lessened upon Britons. But Jess, of course, that is a problem.
Thank you, Ella. Jess, the younger generation, do you see this as being a weight around your generation's shoulders that you're going to be paying for the rest of your life? Do you think that it's worth it, essentially? Just really quickly on that, Jess.
I think there are ways to cut down carbon emissions without sacrificing the individual's choice. I don't think young people will be thankful when we have to pay higher in taxes, when we have less choice in terms of consumer powers, when, you know, we have I just don't think it's fair on the individual or young people who, like you said, will have to pay for it. The government's incompetent. I think we should leave it up to the free markets.
Yeah, get government out of the way and let the market decide. That's Jess Gill's view, and Ella Cott-Michael there. Thank you very much for joining us today on our Campus Clash. Now, folks, you have been watching Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes. Thank you very much for your company, as ever. The show's on every Saturday and Sunday at 2 o'clock. But for now, folks, I'm going to leave yous with the weather.
Hello, I'm Alastair Stewart, and I'd invite you to join me at noon on Saturdays and Sundays for Alastair Stewart and Friends. I've been in this business for over 40 years. Now, here at GB News, I've never been happier. I get to choose the big stories that really interest me. We hear what you have to say, and you hear what I have to say. I really hope you can join me